You're listening to the Veterans Heritage Hour on the Vets on Media Network.
Good morning, Arizona, and welcome to our listeners from around the globe. My name is Joe Brett.
And I'm David Lucier.
And you're listening to the Veterans Heritage Hour. We have a great show, we think, for you today. And it's the first show in a 3-show series regarding the New America Foundation and the study of warfare at ASU. It's a joint venture between Arizona State University and it's a newly formed study. New America Foundation is a newly formed organization to study warfare in addition to other issues germane to a changing world situation.
And if we look at the New America in and of itself, a little write-up here says, New America is dedicated to the renewal of American politics, prosperity, and purpose in the digital age through big ideas, technological innovations, next generation politics, and creative engagement with broad audiences.
So you, the listeners, are part of the broad audiences, and we are your humble messengers, if you will. To have this in Arizona is remarkable, and we can only say that Michael Crow was the founder of New America with Anne Marie Saunders, who was a head of policy and planning for the U.S. State Department. So for some reason, those two people, those two educated and enlightened people, have taken it upon themselves to create a New America Foundation with these really overreaching goals that touch not only on the study of warfare, but they also center on domestic politics. And so what we're doing today in this show is setting up the rationale as we see it, as David and I see it, for a study. And we're going to be introducing our guests next week are going to be Daniel Rothenberg, who was the co-director for the study of warfare, and another New America member, Lorelei Kelly, who was an expert in domestic issues, if you will, and certainly congressional politics. And they're going to have a lot to say about warfare and our own domestic politics and how they see themselves as being interfacers with the current situation and how they're going to bring technology and better minds to bear on situations that are quite overwhelming right now. Wouldn't you think, David?
Well, I think so. And it falls right in line with the founding concept of the Veterans Heritage Hour,
yes,
where history meets the future of warfare.
Exactly.
And all that entails. We've obviously come a long way since World War II, where there was us and them. Big armies, and of course we know the outcome, but today's environment is much more complex, and that's where we're getting to get to where we are and where we're going. I think we've had some good shows on some military history,
yes,
and we'll continue to do that, but then it'll also bring us to today, and then we'll be able to look a little bit in the future and get different perspectives on what this might look like, particularly what the impact might be, not only on a nation or a state or individuals, but in particularly how that may impact our veterans and our veteran population, not only today, but again, the future of our armed forces and those young men and women who will be coming into uniform and seeing what happens, what their options may be.
Right. So, and all of this is predicated on the recent opinions by Thomas Ricks and others that we've had the pleasure of listening to at the News Center. But the outlook is not too good right now. We've been at war for 13 years in Iraq, and we didn't achieve political objectives. People are opining that we have not the military. We have the best military money can buy, and yet we're not achieving the objectives that they're set out to accomplish. Our political situation, as we know, is fractured. There's a lot of money involved in it. There's a lot of PR politics involved in it, and it's tough to discern what is actually truthful and what is part of our national security interests vis-a-vis what is important to one party versus another
Well,
party.
it goes to the whole idea, I believe, Joe, of complexity. And you just named several. It goes to the military industrial complex. It goes to Congress. It goes to religion. It goes to education. It goes to a whole array of complexity. All these elements that go into these kinds of questions, and then we have to discern where we're going. What are we going to do with this information?
Exactly. And what's the end result and what's in the U.S. National interest. So what we thought we would do today, this is our first show in a 3-part series that today David and I will kind of set up the remaining 2 shows. Next week, we have Daniel Rothenberg, as I said, the co-director of the Center for the Study of Warfare. He and Peter Bergen of CNN fame and notoriety are the co-chairs of that, and we've met them both, and they're outstanding individuals. We've met the speakers that they've brought in, and they're outstanding. They're certainly thought-provoking. There's no doubt about that, and they're credentialed and they're educated to have an opinion, have certainly traveled and walked the walk to have an opinion about what they're talking about.
As a slight aside there, if you remember, Joe, we attended an event at Arizona State University about the future of warfare.
Exactly.
A few weeks ago, and up on stage were several flag officers, general officers, and I remember kind of elbowing you in the ribs as we sat next to each other, and I said, Joe, can you take a look at who our guests are here today? And nobody on that panel has ever won a war.
Yes.
So it's one of the things that sort of gave us impetus to start talking about these kinds of issues.
Sure. And so the second show, as we mentioned, it will be Lorelei Kelly. She worked as a staffer for the U.S. Senate. She had a high security clearance, and she certainly has some opinions. And she opined that our U.S. Congress has given itself a lobotomy. It couldn't be any dumber by self-inflicted policies and procedures that have dumbed down our Congress. And we can see that now. You know, Congress was debating to shut down the Office of Homeland Security at a time when we are receiving threats from the Middle East that people want to bomb our shopping centers.
Not just threats from the Middle East, but a Middle East that is in such total flex, I should say flux, not flex, but
yeah.
And so those sands are constantly changing. If you look at now Iran's role there, and one of the elements, one of the countries fighting ISIS is Iran.
Right.
So
joining us in Iraq to forward ISIS, the common threat.
Again, it's not only complexity, but it's complexity that changes. Now we're seeing almost hourly in real time.
Yes.
And we're seeing this, we see it in the internet, we see it in the reporting, we see it, it's an ongoing situation where things change so dramatically that sometimes it's hard to pin down exactly what our next step should be.
And so there are those who are saying we ought to act, and we ought to act now, we ought to do something, but then we throw in our actions into a volatile situation where it's very tough to discern who our friends are and what's going on in that region. And the minute we enter the fray, the whole equation changes. Are we being used? You know, our enemies would want to draw us in, ISIS, because then they have the great Satan to rally against and to increase their members.
And history tells us at one point, Osama bin Laden was our guy in Afghanistan.
Exactly. And yeah, Osama bin Laden was our guy, and so was the dictator in Iraq was our guy against the war with Iran historically. So we're in a furball, as they would say in the Air Force, of activity in the Middle East. So how do we pick this out? So we want to take a few minutes here to talk about, in the first section, we're going to talk about what we call the enemy situation. We're looking at this from a veteran military perspective. Essentially, who's going to get us killed? You know, where's our life going to be at risk, and where are our soldiers going to be at risk? So we look at the Middle East, and it's dividing itself along sectarian lines between Sunni and Shiites. And there's Saudi Arabia, there's Jordan, there's Egypt, there's Lebanon, and maybe Qatar. On one side of this is the Sunni side, and they have issues with Iran, and that's really between Saudi Arabia probably and Iran for dominance in the Middle East, and there's two powers are fighting it out. And then Iran is linked in with Syria, and Iran also sponsors fighters Hezbollah and Hamas, which have been troublemakers forever. And then you throw in the complexity of Russia. And Russia is aligned with Iran. Russia is aligned with Syria by supporting arms historically. And so they're involved in the mix. And now we got Russia involved also in Ukraine, where we want to have some harmony and some harmonious relationships. And
this is kind of like, Joe, I'm getting a picture here of a jigsaw puzzle,
right,
whose pieces constantly change.
Yes.
How do you piece together this picture, this puzzle,
right,
when the pieces constantly change?
Right, as never before. So we know that there was an Arab Spring. So those forces in the Middle East who want some type of modernity, who want some type of educational enrichment, who also want employment enrichment, they're claiming, they're clamoring to be free of this oppressiveness of some aspects of Islam, I would think, or Islamic leadership. They're clamoring to be free. We've seen it in Iran. We've seen it across the Middle East. But the minute they rise up, they create a vacuum where these hardliners, these conservatives come in and quash it down. But nonetheless, there are those voices for modernity within that society, we think. And so you were there, David. What did you think when you were in Iraq? David, by the way, was a Special Forces soldier in Vietnam of Green Beret. And he also served in Iraq and Afghanistan as a contractor. What did you think when you were in Iraq, David?
Well, it was just such an interesting mix, and that's I think where I came to terms with the complexity of that society. It wasn't we will be greeted as liberators, far from it. There were many factions, and if you started at the very base, and you're talking about families and clans, it's something that the United States and Americans really weren't. They really weren't prepared to address that level of social structure.
Sure.
And the ramifications were significant. You may have, when you were trying to work with one clan or one tribe even, it could be that there was an interrelationship with as an uncle or even a brother or a sister or brother who may have a different perspective. And so you've got all these conflicts, these internal conflicts that you're trying to adjust for in this idea of nation building, when we didn't even understand really the very basic social structure. Once we began to understand that, it became a little bit more apparent later on that perhaps it would be better for us just to purchase some friendship, and that's what we did in Anbar province out in western Iraq. We basically purchased our friends, and they laid down their arms and decided to go about their business for a price.
So one of my heroes in history is Lawrence of Arabia. And so reading his book, or a book about his life, reveals that the Brits did the same. You know, he went in with a stacked pile of gold to pay off various factions and to get them to follow his leadership, I guess you would will. But he had a hell of a time organizing these clans and tribes into any type of fighting force. And it was when he went from region to region, as he was taking his Arab fighters into different territories that were controlled by a competing clan, the other tribes of which were once with him dropped off because they didn't want to fight in someone else's territory. So then he had to pick up another group of fighters from another clan, another tribe.
Their interests were very parochial and continue to be.
And continue to be is the whole point, and we needed money to buy it off. So let's get cynical here as we're going to delve into both the Middle East. And we have to get cynical because we now know from our own personal experience that what we see and what we're being told are not necessarily true represent. There's people working us. There's millions of dollars being spent to sway public opinion one way or the other. And we still don't know, and we're going to need expert advice in telling us what really is in America's interest. But we certainly don't know that today, but we're going to bring in the experts who can help define it. But we're just teeing this thing up so we can all have a voice kind of in thinking this through. But the thing that bothered me or spells out the real cynicism and the real horror of the Middle East is that the Iran war, we were backing Iraq against the Iranians. And the Iranians were sending military units, infantry units across the desert into Iraq. And the Iraq forces under Saddam Hussein built these huge minefields that the Iranian military would have to cross through and blow themselves up. And so to blow up the mines,
Clear a path.
to clear a path for the infantry, the religious leaders in Iran recruited children, promising them that if they would do what Allah wanted them to do, they would all be in heaven, enjoying toys and life of untold joy. And they were put in front of the infantry units to trigger the minefields, to blow themselves up, to trigger the minefields so the infantry could get through to Iraq. And so what did the Iraqis came up with? Poison gas. So either with our knowledge, which everybody seems to think that they had, Iraq acquired poison gas, and they used the poison gas to kill the kids who were recruited by the mullahs, right, in Iran. They killed the kids without tripping the mines. And so you had gas warfare to kill kids that were recruited by mullahs so the infantry could come through. And so this, to me, spells out the Middle East. The horrendous loss of life and the killing of life in some religious contexts. It's just mind blowing. The efforts of people that would go through, the leaders would go through to their own end. And so we're now in the middle of that, on steroids. This whole thing is shaking itself out like it never has before, since this is like the end of World War I, realizing itself. This is like Lawrence of Arabia ending his efforts to organize a Pan-Arabia with a headquarters in Damascus. And now we have this Middle East that's aligning itself finally. And finally, there's now an analysis of religion within Islam itself to see how that's going to shake out. So this is all really, it's like the ending of World War I in that part of the world, and maybe the ending of the 8th century, really, and kind of in a debate on modernity. Maybe there's an open-ended goodness in this, that we're finally having, the world is debating through the horrors of this ISIS movement, the manifestation of horror itself is having everyone in the world maybe taking a second look at this.
Well, and you talk about everyone in the world, and you're exactly right. Aside from the fact that, these all this information is being broadcast and shared via the internet, but getting back to your term, everybody in the world, that's exactly right. Russia,
right?
The European nations, China, the United States. You've got all these folks involved. And just a quick anecdote here. When I was in Iraq, we were responsible for disposing of ordnance. Mm-hmm. And there were 55, 60 of these huge sites across the country. When we were blowing up on one site, about 100 tons a day, something in that. But when we look through the inventory, everybody who manufactured ordnance supplied Iraq during the Iraq-Iranian War. Everybody. Mm-hmm. There was Russian weapons, there was Chinese weapons, there was Romanian, there was U.S.
Sure.
U.S. ordnance. So again, it takes on a global perspective and just adds to the complexity of today's situation.
And not to mention the military-industrial complex is now wrapping up as they're gearing up of more war, as better weaponry and better production and more money rolling through Congress and rolling through
well, if you look at a lot of the foreign aid goes out in the form of credits to foreign governments. And what do they have to do with that credit? They have to turn around and buy American weaponry.
Sure. Well, listen, we're going to continue our conversation. We're going to open up the lines here because we want to hear from you now as we enter in this critical stage in the Veterans Heritage Hour. This is where military history meets the future of warfare. And we think this is a defining moment, both in our show's history and in American history and in the world history. This is a defining moment, and we want to guide the listeners through this, and we bring in the experts who can really answer these questions.
And the Birdman, I think, is going to bring up the telephone number, which is 602-399-7787, and those lines will be open shortly. We'd like to hear from you. You have questions. We'd like to maybe do our best to try and answer them or guide them, and we will save them for our experts in the weeks to come.
Sure. So stand by. You're listening to Veterans Heritage Hour. We will be back in about 2 minutes.
Veterans served us, now it's time we serve them. As a veteran of Afghanistan and Iraq, as well as a current military member deployed abroad, I would like to take a minute of your time to tell you about Patriot Hills of New York. Patriot Hills of New York is a nonprofit organization providing support to veterans and their families. They partner veterans in need with over 65 health and wellness organizations, community groups, as well as philanthropic foundations providing no or low-cost services. They've helped over 400 veterans through confidential referral services, assistance with veterans issues, employment placement, as well as educational opportunities. If you need assistance or just want to help veterans by donating your time or services, contact them at info@patriothills.org. Again, that's info@patriothills.org. Visit patriothillsnewyork.com for more information about their services or how you can donate. Our veterans deserve no less. We can give it to them, and you can help.
Would you like to own a thriving business and help employ local veterans? The Vetraplex Handyman Construction and Landscape business is the opportunity you've been waiting for. The Vetraplex is your gateway to an affordable startup business with 0% financing for qualifying owners. By owning a Vetraplex franchise, you will be hiring veterans, providing them both income and opportunity, while at the same time providing your customers a way to say, thank you for your service to our nation's veterans. For more information, visit vetraplex.org. Again, that's vetraplex.org or call 928-284-2022.
Breaker 19. How about that bandit? You got them ears on, son?
Have you ever wanted to be a truck driver? If so, pay attention. If not, pay attention anyway. Southwest Truck Driver Training offers everything you need to get started. You can get hired before you begin training. They've got GI Bill approved training facilities, day, night, or weekend programs to fit your busy schedule. And if you have any questions, no sweat. They've got veteran supportive campuses with veterans on staff to serve you. And on top of that, they have lifetime job placement assistance. Put the pedal to the metal. Call Southwest Truck Driver Training today.
Everyone's going to need an attorney at some point in their life. I'm no different. Hey, everyone, it's James from Vets On. Whether it was my last will and testament before deployment or my ongoing custody battle for my children during my divorce, I needed help, so I lawyered up. If you need help, I urge you to contact Capstrom Law Firm. Capstrom Law Firm in Springfield, Missouri services clients throughout the state in criminal law, personal injury, and family law. With over 13 years practicing law, Tom Capstrom understands both law and court procedures and how stressful they can be. Let Tom Capstrom Law Firm and his dedicated staff take the stress and worry out of a difficult situation by calling him today. We feel so strong about the work that Tom and his staff are doing that he'll be a monthly guest on the show. Tom is a veteran and a listener, for God's sake, so you know the guy is solid and will fight for you. Give Tom a call today by calling 417-864-0552 or email Tom at capstromlaw.com. And don't forget to tell him that Vets On sent you.
The choice of a lawyer is an important decision and should not be based solely upon advertising.
If you or someone you know is looking for a new job or career, you need to visit the pros. National Career Fairs at ncfairs.com. National Career Fairs hosts over 300 career fairs a year nationwide. The events are free and give you the perfect chance to meet some of the top employers in your area face-to-face. To find the nearest career fair to you, visit ncfairs.com. Again, that's ncfairs.com. What are you waiting for?
You're listening to the Veterans Heritage Hour on the Vets On Media Network.
Hey, welcome back to Vets on Media. This is Joe Brett. I'm with David Lucer, and we're talking about the complexity of the world in which we now find ourselves and which our soldiers are going to somehow and are deployed and will be continued to be deployed. And we want to help the listeners and ourselves sort out why they are fighting, where they are fighting, and is it in America's interest, and are we being told the truth by our leaders about the reasons for their deployment. I don't think there's any need right now to discuss the evilness of ISIS, but pretty soon the politicians are going to start cranking on this, and we have to be careful.
Well, and
know.
I think they already have, Joe.
Yeah.
As a matter of fact, I mean, when we carry the theme across from international complexity, I think that we can see the same complexity, and they're different elements, but it makes it's still just as complex when we talk about the domestic political structure and situation. We used to have pretty different parties, Democrat, Republican, and now we've injected a lot of, if you will, third parties. There's probably a third, fourth, and fifth party in there, but the major element of late is the conservative GOP,
Sure.
where they're having a hard time kind of keeping their party together and coming up with a script that everybody's comfortable with. And so instead of a two-way conversation, we're having a three-way conversation.
And even a four-way conversation.
And even a four-way conversation, absolutely. And we see that as it develops. For instance, in the latest iteration was this funding of the Department of Homeland Security and all its complexity.
So here we are in the United States of America under threat by ISIS, who has mentioned that they want to blow up malls and disrupt American society. They've said that overtly. We've seen evidence of it geographically. England and Canada and Australia and other places, even the U.S. And yet, at the same time, when we face this threat, Congress is wanting to shut down the department that's going to prevent that. I mean, it's absurd, really, and it's just crazy to contemplate.
Well, it depends on your perspective, Joe. You know, it's crazy if it's you and me who have a certain perspective, and we're sitting here in a nice, safe United States of America. But if you're a politician who needs political capital, maybe it makes a whole lot of sense.
And there's a question right there. You hit the nail on the head, and that's the issue. When I was at the Kennedy, David and I are both graduates of a Kennedy school. You went to the Kennedy School of Warfare, and I went to the Kennedy School of Government.
The John F. Kennedy School for Special Warfare,
Right.
in Fort Bragg, North Carolina.
Hoorah. And so I had later on in my life gone to the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard, really to find out, one of the reasons I'd gone was to sort out my Vietnam experience, you know, who, what, when, and where, who was in charge, and why did we get involved in that mess, and how do we get into wars, and who's responsible for them, and how could a great country make such big mistakes? And one of my professors there was Kurt Campbell, who's had a distinguished career since he left the Kennedy School as a professor. He's gone on to the jobs in the State Department and the National Security Council and the Department of Defense. And but anyway, under his tutelage, we learned at one time there was a thing called just and unjust wars. And that was, and Andrew Bacevich in his book, The New American Militarism, points this out and discusses this. It used to be that America would see when its national interests were violated, sea lanes were being closed, something was being threatened, and if our national interests were at risk, we would then be justified in the use of military force. And that all seemed to have gone by the wayside when after Vietnam, people decided we wanted to go to Vietnam. That was a war of choice. The dominoes were going to fall. And it seems the politicians got involved with that, and the military complex got involved with that, and we went to a war for 10 or more years, in a war that never should have been fought, arguably. And we thought that mistake would never be made again, and yet again, here we went off to Iraq on a war of choice, a preemptive war, if you will, a war of choice. So who makes these decisions? And what are the thoughts behind this? Is it, there are schools of thought, there are think tanks, and we want to get into that a little bit.
And that's where we get into process.
Right.
It's a hugely important piece of this entire question, and the political spectrum is process. How these decisions are made, who makes them.
Sure.
And then, of course, the outcomes are particularly important because talk is talk on one side, and outcome may have particularly egregious outcomes.
Sure.
And impacts.
Well, we know that we got into Iraq and we didn't have an after-action plan. So the neoconservatives who were in charge of that thinking, William Kristol and others who were involved in thinking this through, Paul Wolfowitz was one, and Condoleezza Rice.
Donnie Rumsfeld indicated one day that it may take 5 days, it may take 5 weeks, it may take 5 months in Iraq, but certainly no longer than that.
Exactly.
That was 15 years ago.
And interestingly enough, back then, when we decided to invade Iraq, a guy by the name of Benjamin Netanyahu from Israel came over to speak to Congress about the dead certain solid fact that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction, including nuclear weapons, that he was going to use to destroy the Middle East and to certainly demolish Israel. He knew for a fact that that was the case. And here he is 13 years later, he's back in town. And so there seems to be the required hysteria being raised by one party to say there's this dead certain threat out there that we have to retaliate against.
The mushroom cloud argument.
The mushroom cloud argument. So who is behind this mushroom cloud argument? Because it seems that in addition to the threats from the Middle East of people who are sworn to get us, we also have domestically factions within here. We have a conservative point of view, a worldview. We have a more progressive point of view. And depending on which point of view one has, the likelihood of war without use of diplomatic means is heightened. I mean, the LBJ said he didn't want to be the guy that lost Vietnam to the communists like his predecessors had lost China. So you could see in a domestic sense that right-wing and Christian-backed organizations see this big threat as a war of religions, and they want to get involved into this furball that is so complex in the Middle East that the minute we get in there, we're in trouble.
Well, and what's interesting to me, the argument has largely shifted from, if you will, national interest, one of resource development,
right.
Political relationships, to one of an ethical argument, one that depends on your, if you will, your moral perspective,
Sure.
which then translates to, well, which God do you really believe in?
Sure.
And so then we're back into a religious war. And that, I think, that needs to be discussed, that needs to be brought forward, that needs to be argued and debated vigorously.
And so there's no debate in Congress. Now there's a bill before Congress, right, to talk about the use of force against ISIS. The president has been using the language that has been used since 9/11, really, to take on our adversaries, but there's been no real debate within our society as to how we are then going to take on this series of non-nation threats.
But we're going to do that right here at Veterans Heritage Hour.
Of course,
by golly.
that's right. And hopefully somebody's going to call in here and at least or go to our Facebook, because we want to get your questions as well as our concerns. And when our experts get here, we will be more informed as to what questions to ask to answer the questions that all of us have. But let's keep in mind here one important factor. James Fallows and others are calling this chicken hawk nation, in that the people who are always striving to push us towards war are the last people who were, they're going to go to war with someone else's kid doing the fighting. We're
going to fight that war to the last drop of your blood, Joe.
Exactly. So we saw that with, LBJ when he, in our war, we had the Gulf of Tonkin resolution based upon a felonious attack on our ships that were actually probably in North Vietnamese waters. But they used that to hype a war that this politician, LBJ, needed for some political reason to show that he was tough on communism. And bingo, there we were. And then by 1967, they knew they couldn't win it, and he was trying to stop the war. And then President Nixon, we heard,
private citizen Nixon at the time,
sabotaged the talks by sending over Chiang Kai-shek's Claire Chennault's widow to talk with the then leader of the South Vietnamese government not to sign the peace treaty, because he'd get a better deal when Nixon got in the White House. And lo and behold, the war went on long after that, with the most casualties happening after Nixon took over. And they signed the same treaty in 1973 that they could have signed in 1967. And who cared about the American troops that were slogging through the jungles for those remaining years? I mean, it's a travesty and an injustice to the American soldier and to the kids who did all that fighting.
Well, you're talking about over 58,000 deaths and hundreds of thousands of wounded, not to mention the wounds unseen.
And not to mention the 3 million Vietnamese we killed.
Well, there's it's a lot of death and destruction across the board
for domestic politics.
For domestic politics.
So now we have another White House under contention, right? 2016 is looming. So do we have the same cries now from politicians on one side of who's tougher on Islam? Who's the best supporter of Israel? So that's now not a national problem. It's now become sectarian. Which party is going to then see?
And therein lies a massive amount of complexity. How in the world do you have a public debate about God
Yes.
when it comes to your foreign policy and your domestic policy, for
Right.
that matter? That makes it almost impossible to have a dialogue or a conversation as soon as you bring in your God.
So here we have a book here that I thought is terrific. Got 5 minutes, but to the break. But The End of Days, the fundamentalism and the struggle for the Temple Mount. So essentially, you have two religions. The Christianity and Judaism believes that for God to come or come back to earth and solve all the problems and convert everyone to Christianity, if you're a Christian, he has to come back to the Temple Mount, right? There has to be a third temple built on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. That's what the fundamentalists believe in Christianity and Islam, and not in Islam, but in
And which God is coming back?
the God that they believe in, of course.
Okay.
But that God is going to come back, but it has to come back to the Temple Mount. They have to build a third temple there, which is now the site, Temple Mount, is to the Muslims, is where Muhammad ascended into heaven. So it's a sacred site to the Muslims. It's a sacred site for Christians, and it's a sacred site for Jews. The Wailing Wall is now the last remnant of the last temple, right? So,
And all of that, of course, is peppered with the basic foundation of faith. They call it faith because it's not rationale or
Right,
reason.
exactly.
It's faith.
but that's what these fundamentalist groups are driving that. And there's a fundamentalist religion part of politics. And so the fundamentalists, the right-wing people, have to bring in those religious Christian type movement. If we're listening to Andrew Bacevich, he talks about onward soldiers, Christian soldiers. So there is a nexus between politics and religion fighting its way out. And so it could happen that we could get involved like we did in Vietnam by domestic politics. It might have nothing to do, if we just did nothing in the Middle East, it would probably, the best thing would be to let them finally solve their own issues with a little bit of guidance and from us. But they seem to be on their way to doing that. But if some movement over here gets carried away with, let's get in and get involved because we need a Christian point of view, that could trigger this whole conflation that would take us into even more dangerous situations and an even wider war than we're in right now.
And I'm not sure you can debate religion.
No.
It's an impossible task.
Well, it is impossible, but it's part and parcel, it seems, of this huge spending machine. There's this dark money, and there's these causes that seem to have a Christian bent,
or an Islamic bent,
or an Islamic
or a Jewish bent.
Yes, and there's dark money and so the Jewish lobby now is influential, as you know. In Charlie Wilson's war, when Charlie Wilson, he was a supporter of Israel and voted accordingly. Well, they poured all kinds of money in his district in Texas.
Oh, that's right. I remember we talked to Fahim about that,
right? And we
a
have
couple of weeks ago.
So this political situation here is up for grabs. There's dark money. We know that politics is sinister. Truth is probably the first casualty of a political campaign, and we're in the midst of a big ramp up here in 2016 for the next presidential election.
$1 billion.
$1 billion, and so we're spending $1 billion in dark money. Not to mention, someone mentioned that the $1 trillion that we spent in the war in Iraq to date would be better off having been burnt. Had we taken that $1 trillion and burnt it, we would have done ourselves more good than had we spent that $1 trillion.
Oh, if it were only $1 trillion. A lot of estimates go somewhere between 3 and 6.
Yeah. And so we're concerned here now about the veteran. And when we come back, we want to talk about what's in it for the veteran here, because in the midst of everything that's happened, all the dark money and the sinister politics and everything, we have a VA that doesn't work. We have veterans who are struggling, who have not been looked after, have not been cared for. We had people sent 3 and 4 and 5 tours. We have had stop loss. We have had short, when the politics failed, Thomas Ricks, the Pulitzer Prize winning author, says the problem with our military leaders now, there's no accountability. When things go wrong, no one suffers, but the troops suffer. And when mightily. And so when you get guys that went over to be supply officers are kicking in doors, your foreign policy has changed dramatically. So who's in it for the veterans? We hope that our station here is of and by and for veterans, and that we can speak coherently on their behalf and get some answers from people that, as we study the future of warfare, let's think about who's going to be fighting that war, the next wars, and with what weapons. And we'll get to that when we come back from our break. You're listening to the Veterans Heritage Hour. We'll be back in about 2 to 5 minutes, right, Birdman? Stay tuned.
Veterans served us. Now it's time we serve them. As a veteran of Afghanistan and Iraq, as well as a current military member deployed abroad, I would like to take a minute of your time to tell you about Patriot Hills of New York. Patriot Hills of New York is a nonprofit organization providing support to veterans and their families. They partner veterans in need with over 65 health and wellness organizations, community groups, as well as philanthropic foundations providing no or low-cost services. They've helped over 400 veterans through confidential referral services, assistance with veterans issues, employment placement, as well as educational opportunities. If you need assistance or just want to help veterans by donating your time or services, contact them at info@patriothills.org. Again, that's info@patriothills.org. Visit patriothillsnewyork.com for more information about their services or how you can donate. Our veterans deserve no less. We can give it to them, and you can help. Everyone's going to need an attorney at some point in their life. I'm no different. Hey everyone, it's James from Vets On. Whether it was my last will and testament before deployment or my ongoing custody battle for my children during my divorce, I needed help, so I lawyered up. If you need help, I urge you to contact Capstrom Law Firm. Capstrom Law Firm in Springfield, Missouri services clients throughout the state in criminal law, personal injury, and family law. With over 13 years practicing law, Tom Capstrom understands both law and court procedures and how stressful they can be. Let Tom Capstrom Law Firm and his dedicated staff take the stress and worry out of a difficult situation by calling him today. We feel so strong about the work that Tom and his staff are doing that he'll be a monthly guest on the show. Tom is a veteran and a listener, for God's sake, so you know the guy is solid and will fight for you. Give Tom a call today by calling 417-864-0552 or email Tom at capstromlaw.com. And don't forget to tell him that Vets On sent you.
The choice of a lawyer is an important decision and should not be based solely upon advertising.
Breaker 19. How about that bandit? You got some ears on, son?
Have you ever wanted to be a truck driver? If so, pay attention. If not, pay attention anyway. Southwest Truck Driver Training offers everything you need to get started. You can get hired before you begin training. They've got GI Bill approved training facilities, day, night, or weekend programs to fit your busy schedule. And if you have any questions, no sweat. They've got veteran supportive campuses with veterans on staff to serve you. And on top of that, they have lifetime job placement assistance. Put the pedal to the metal. Call Southwest Truck Driver Training today.
If you or someone you know is looking for a new job or career, you need to visit the pros. National Career Fairs at ncfairs.com. National Career Fairs hosts over 300 career fairs a year nationwide. The events are free and give you the perfect chance to meet some of the top employers in your area face-to-face. To find the nearest career fair to you, visit ncfairs.com. Again, that's ncfairs.com. What are you waiting for?
Would you like to own a thriving business and help employ local veterans? The Vetraplex Handyman Construction and Landscape business is the opportunity you've been waiting for. The Vetraplex is your gateway to an affordable startup business with 0% financing for qualifying owners. By owning a Vetraplex franchise, you will be hiring veterans, providing them both income and opportunity, while at the same time providing your customers a way to say, thank you for your service to our nation's veterans. For more information, visit vetraplex.org. Again, that's vetraplex.org or call 928-284-2022.
You're listening to the Veterans Heritage Hour on the Vets On Media Network.
Hey, this is Joe Brett and David Lucere. We're back on our conversation here on Veterans Heritage Hour. We're talking about the current situation in the world in which we will be deploying troops. And we're opining and kind of setting up questions and kind of a dialogue for our next 2 shows. Next week will be Daniel Rothenberg and Lorelei Kelly, both members of New America
Why don't you give us a
Foundation.
little backgrounder on both of those folks, Joe? Both very high-powered people, knowledgeable. They come with a knowledge base that's second to none, really.
Right. I met Lorelei, actually. I met her at the Kennedy School when I was back for a mini reunion here several months ago. And Lorelei is a graduate of Grinnell College in Stanford, and she was in a senior staffer in the U.S. Senate, and has been working on now on. She worked on a bipartisan committee in Congress on the Senate for open technology.
So she's got hands-on experience, real life experience.
Right. She's worked on a House Senate bipartisan study group on global security. She also attended the Air Command and Staff College of the U.S. Air Force. Lorelei has published numerous articles and is the co-author of 2 books, both free and available online. So if you Google search Lorelei Kelly, you're going to find what a remarkable woman she is. She coined the phrase, and she accused the Congress of performing a lobotomy on itself. And if you watch them operate, you can see that she is probably right. And so she is now involved with the New America Foundation. She'll be calling in.
And that was a structural shift in Congress, was it not?
Well, she told me that the most interesting thing was that when the Republican Congress came in, and now don't all the Republicans go crazy with us, David and I are trying to stay nonpartisan here, but she opined that the Congress fired staffers, which are the institutional memory, and they fired staffers and they contracted the work out to the Heritage Foundation, which is
for policy research and
guidance, right?
Guidance,
And
yeah.
Jim DeMint was a former, senior congressman, and he's formed this Heritage Foundation, which has, backs right-wing candidates, conservative right-wing candidates, and so the U.S. Congress contracted out their institutional advice to a partisan think tank, and in the meantime fired staffers. So we're going to hear from Lorelei Kelly to tell us more about that and what that implications are. So how are you going to make good decisions in the Middle East and these very complex worlds, in a very complex world, if you're listening to one side of the argument, obviously a pro-Christian right-wing side of it, if in fact that's what Congress has done and that's where they're getting their advice. So it makes a look from a broad perspective of an American point of view, what's in U.S. interest. It kind of narrows that down.
Well, to me, it also indicates an institutional change
Right.
in the process and how we come to this thing we call public policy.
Exactly. And public policy is what the New America is all about, of how we overcome big money, dark money, and PR politics, void of any necessity of being factual or truthful. Where is the repository of truth? We really don't know anymore. So for everybody out there listening, not a big deal, it's just politics, right? But if you're in uniform, these are life and death issues. These
They're
are
absolutely life and death issues. I mean, you and I have been there, done that.
we have been used. We have been at the pointy end of the spear that we thought at one point in time that's what our nation wanted. What it really wasn't our nation.
Just as a reminder, Joe flew missions in a bird dog, which I barely think is an airplane
come
anyway,
on, come on.
but flew missions over the DMZ as an aerial observer and forward air controller. So these are things that are real life, true to life, our experiences. I served in Vietnam. I ran up and down the Ho Chi Minh Trail as a Special Forces Mike Force guy. And so we've experienced the outcomes on these public policy issues, and we continue to feel their effect, not only now as civilians, but also when we look out across the horizon. We look at our current men and women in uniform, as well as our current veterans, our current generation
Right.
veterans. They're all participants, and they have an impact on on our men and women in uniform and our veterans.
So if there's no accountability for the generals and others to get it wrong, according to Thomas Ricks, if there's no consequences, and we've, Paul Wolfowitz screwed up, or arguably neoconservatism or the neocons got the Iraq war wrong. And where did he wind up? At the World Bank. Well, the veterans who went 4 and 5 and 6 tours and, faced divorces and PTSD and issues, they didn't have a VA. They didn't have, no one cared for them. There was no back out strategy for those people who bore the brunt of a failed policy. So David and I would like to think that we're speaking on their behalf of future soldiers and future men and women, the people who will be wearing the uniform of the United States. Who is their lobby group? Who's looking after them? Are there going to be, there's people now in Congress raising up they're raising their fists that we're going to be tough, we're going to be tough. Well, they're all going to be tough, but they're going to be tough with someone else's kids, right? Less than 1% of the people in the United States are in uniform. And that's, and the people who are, and it's voluntary. It's a voluntary force. So,
well, and Admiral Mullen several years ago, and the idea, the concept continues, is that when you divide out and separate those military and veteran communities and separate them from the civilian, non-veteran, non-military civilians, the chances are that the outcomes in public policy is not going to be very optimal.
Sure.
And when these non-veterans, non-military folks put forth public policy that affects men and women in uniform, we got to make sure that it's right, because it is a life or death situation.
And it is, and we're going to have, hopefully, the third part of this series, we're going to have David Friedovich on board. He is a deputy, David. And
Friedo is
your man,
is my man, and was the deputy commander at U.S. SOCOM for several years before
Special
he retired.
Operations Command.
Yes, the Special Operations Command, and he lives out this way, and we're going to have him on the show in 2 weeks.
So he commanded forces, Special Operations Forces in the Pacific at one point in time. And interestingly enough, the Pacific is where my friend Kurt Campbell and the Obama administration wants to make a pivot away from the Middle East and all that nonsense to the future, which is going to be India and China and a resurgent and really quite economically stimulating Pacific region, Asian Pacific region.
Seems to me that right now that's going to be a tough pivot to
It's
make.
going to be a tough pivot, but why would we want to hang on there for 4 minutes we've got left here?
Can you say tar baby?
Yeah, right. So, winding down our, the new war, it can't be against Islam, because I lived in Indonesia, which is now a huge, successful democracy. So we can't be at war with Islam, because you'd be at war with Indonesia, and that's one of the loveliest places to live and be around. They're great, great people. I worked in Kazakhstan with many Muslims, and we have a sister city in Marrakesh, Morocco, with terrific young students. And so Islam is not our enemy. It's this faction within, and I think we ought to stand on guard to make sure that forces that have sinister interest are not trying to whiplash us into some reactionary knee-jerk thing against all of Islam.
A new crusade doesn't seem to get us anywhere in our national interests or our financial interests or our health and well-being.
No. And so as we fight our new warfares, we have to think about what is, now we have Bitcoin. Now we have the cloud. And so in World War II, you'd send bombers over to knock out structures. Well, there's nothing in those structures. Our wars seem to be about idealism, about concepts. There's no money in banks. It might be in the cloud. Information is stored elsewhere. So the old systems that we used to fight wars, the technology has shifted. And
do we really understand that shift? And what are those impacts?
Exactly.
What are those outcomes? What are the possibilities of outcomes? Again, all huge, complex questions every step of the way.
And so they said last time, I think Thomas Ricks or someone was saying, or maybe James Fallow saying, we're spending all the money for all the wrong weapons for all the wrong reasons, right? And so,
and boy, do we spend money.
Oh, and so there seems to be Congress is a spigot of wheeling through new ships and new big spending when we probably are going to need more cyber warfare. and more special forces troops and more other types of forces to fight a less physical world and a more surreal, ethereal world, right, where things are beyond physical. And so there's a whole new concept here. New America seems to have gotten a handle on wrestling itself around or wrapping itself around those issues. And we're winding up now, but we want to tease you guys to tune in next week when we're going to have real experts on. We hope we've set the framework and set some of the background of the issues that will be discussed next week when we hear from Daniel Rothenberg and Lorelei Kelly. But David Frudovich, the former Deputy Commander of Special Operations Command, will be on in 2 weeks. And we'll be guiding them through, hopefully mail in some questions, your concerns on our Facebook page, and we want to incorporate your ideas into our conversations and draw you into the dialogue.
And thank you very much for listening and tuning in, and we will talk to you again soon.
Thank you much. We'll see you next week. This is Joe Brett and David Lucero.
What's so proudly we hailed at the twilight